Hello everyone. Our topic this week was requested by all of these lovely people. We'll be going over the Covenant from the Halo franchise. Spoilers for all things Halo. The
Covenant is a society formed from multiple species of aliens that acted as the primary antagonists for most of the Halo game series, with greater or more pervasive threats slowly beginning to replace them as the series continued. The Covenant is formed of 8 races of aliens, 7 if you don't count the Huragox, but more on them later. Each of the alien races has a, quote, proper racial name, as well as a simpler name applied to them by human forces after encountering them in combat. We will list both names, but when applicable, we'll use the simpler name because, well, they're easier to say because they were made by English speakers. The Covenant itself was originally established as a result of a tense alliance between the Sanshum, or prophets, and the Sangheli, or elites, which was brought about by their shared reverence for the Forerunners.
The Forerunners are the Haloverse's resident, ancient, immensely powerful species that spread throughout the galaxy before dying off and leaving sparse records and/or pockets of incredibly advanced technology behind. In this particular case, the Forerunners were fighting a losing battle against the Flood, a race of organic creatures that could absorb the biomass of fallen enemies to increase both their numbers and enhance their effectiveness. There's a link to our video on the Flood in the description below. The Forerunners' final solution was the creation of the titular Halo Arrays, a series of doomsday weapons comprised of massive space rings that were also designed to house life to be reseeded into the galaxy after the ring's activation. For more info on the Halo rings, see our video on them, also in the description. The Halos were fired, resulting in the eventual death of the Forerunners and much of the Flood. Thousands of years later, the species that were reseeded into the galaxy, including humanity and most if not all of the Covenant races, grew and re-advanced till they were capable of space travel, eventually leading to the events of the Halo games and extended media.
The Sanshum, or prophets, evolved on a world filled with old Forerunner artifacts, complete with a largely intact Forerunner ship, more advanced than most any vessels encountered throughout the franchise, as Forerunner technology is universally the most advanced technology encountered in the franchise. Sanshum society universally came to revere the Forerunners as gods, and the relics they left behind as sacred. However, what should be done with those relics became a topic of serious debate, eventually splitting their society in two, with one faction believing that the sacred relics of the Forerunners should be left alone, that to interfere with them was heresy of the highest order. The other faction believed that the Forerunner technology was a gift left behind for them to study and learn from, for the betterment of their people. This second faction occupied the Forerunner ship, which they simply called the Dreadnought, and though battles were fought over it, they eventually learned enough about the ship's systems that they departed their homeworld, seeking to follow in the footsteps of their gods, the Forerunners, while leaving the other faction of their people behind. The Dreadnought faction of the Sanshum had, during their studies, incorrectly translated ancient Forerunner texts talking about the Halo rings, coming to the erroneous conclusion that activation of the rings would allow them to ascend to a higher realm of existence, and that the Forerunners had done just that. So they set off in search of more Forerunner technology and archives in the hopes of locating the rings on what they called their Great Journey, so they too could ascend, not realizing that the Halo rings were actually weapons of mass destruction.
The first alien creatures that they encountered were the Huragox, or engineers. Technically speaking, the engineers are not a race. They are biomechanical automatons created by the Forerunners that serve as maintenance workers for Forerunner technology. They are, however, independent, very intelligent, and capable of creating other engineers, so they are sometimes listed as a race within the Covenant. The engineers are about as neutral as you can get. They'll work with whoever, just so long as their compatriots don't damage Forerunner technology. So, when the Sanshum found a bunch of engineers maintaining a series of Forerunner installations, they scooped them all up and carried them with them on the Great Journey. Thereafter, the engineers would become the Covenant's primary mechanics, tech experts, and researchers, as the Sanshum relied heavily upon the engineers to help them decipher and reverse engineer Forerunner technology going forward.
The next alien species they encountered on their journey were the Sangheli, or elites. The elites had already established a small interstellar society, and like the Sanshum themselves, revered the Forerunners as gods. However, they also believed, like those from the Sanshum's homeworld, that the Forerunner technology was to be left alone and honored as holy relics. This disagreement spawned a war between the two factions that would last for over 50 years. The elites were a people of honor and warfare. They had the Sanshum beaten in numbers, physical combat capability, and military tactics, but the Sanshum had enough technological superiority that the war was slowly grinding in their favor from the get-go. Eventually, the elites realized their options were either suffer death at the hands of their enemies, or break their sacred oaths and plumb the Forerunner ruins for answers to level the playing field. they opted to research Forerunner technology, bringing them to a more equal playing field with the Sanshum. However, in doing so, both sides realized the futility of the fight, that they were both likely to go extinct rather than the war ending with a clear victor. What's more, the elites had broken the vows that had put their people at odds in the first place. And so the two races entered into an alliance, formally giving birth to the Covenant. The Sanshum would act as the religious leaders of their new society, with the elites' religious beliefs being melded together and being subsumed in the process, while the elites were given complete control over all military matters. A joint council of 200 members for both species was created to govern the Covenant, with a ruling triumvirate of Sanshum prophets standing at their head. As part of the union of the two races, the elites joined the Great Journey, and the Dreadnought was converted into the power source for what would become the Covenant's capital city, a massive mobile space station called High Charity. Though the influence of the Covenant would expand drastically over the coming centuries, covering thousands of planets, High Charity would always remain the heart of the Covenant.
The next species encountered by the Covenant is also arguably the most unique, the Letglow, or Hunters. The Letglow are a species of eel or worm-like creatures that are of negligible intelligence individually. However, when they're grouped together, their bodies work in concert to act as a sort of nervous and/or neural system, increasing their cognitive function, physical might, resilience, or some combination of all three. 6 known configurations of Letglow gestalts, or colonies, exist, each with different purposes and resultantly a range of complexities and capabilities. The Letglow are most commonly encountered in-game in the form of hunter units, wherein they have formed together into a massive, durable, physically powerful shape that has then been armed and armored like a tank by the Covenant for battle. They are also responsible for piloting things like the Scarab Siege Walkers as well. The Letglow are capable of surviving even in space in the proper configurations and eat all manner of minerals, and thus had spent centuries learning about and feeding on Forerunner installations in orbit around their homeworld when the Covenant found them. Enraged at this destruction of their holy relics, the prophets ordered the immediate eradication of the Letglow. However, the Covenant's efforts were soon stifled by the dual problems of Letglow's numbers and infantry superiority, thanks to their then unarmored but still powerful hunter forms, as well as the fact that they had infested virtually every crevice of the Forerunner installations the Covenant wanted to preserve, making destroying the Letglow without destroying the Forerunner tech all but impossible. And so, eventually the Letglow were joined to the Covenant. They have no particular interest in the Covenant's religion, but they are given space to breed and feed, they help with technological research and deployment, and are the Covenant's heaviest ground troops.
After that, the Covenant encountered the yanme'e, or drones, a race of insectoid creatures who are surprisingly adept at technology and live in hive structures, their entire society centered around the preservation and wellness of their queens. When engineers aren't available, drones are the next best thing. They're also competent flyers and make excellent air-based infantry in combat. When the Covenant encountered the drones, they were met with immediate hostility by the insectoid race, and the Covenant were actually put on the back foot in battle, being overrun by the sheer number that the drones could field. Perhaps they could have won the war with the drones if they brought their full military might to bear, but the drones had so honeycombed their planet with the hives that it was impossible for the Covenant to determine whether or not Forerunner tech was hidden within the hives somewhere, and were unwilling to risk potentially damaging or destroying holy artifacts. Resultantly, an alliance was made with the drones, though, much to the Covenant's disappointment, no Forerunner technology was found on the drone homeworld.
The kig-yar, or Jackals, were the next species that the Covenant encountered. A matriarchal race, the Jackals had also advanced to a spacefaring community by the time they were encountered. They were people of merchants and pirates, and as such, when Covenant forces first arrived in Jackal space, hordes of pirates immediately swooped down upon them, eager to plunder the Covenant ships. Obviously, this started a war. The Covenant had superior technology, but the Jackals had a home field advantage. The Jackal star system had an unusually dense asteroid field surrounding it, and resultantly, Jackal ships were small and nimble, while Covenant vessels were mighty but large, making them poorly suited to combat in the system. Eventually, however, the Covenant pushed into the system anyway, making way for the Jackals' homeworld, prompting the Jackals to propose a treaty of sorts, which resulted in the Jackals basically joining the Covenant as mercenaries and pirate scouts.
Next came the Ungoi, or Grunts, who have the unfortunate distinction of being the only people the Covenant have ever encountered who were just flat out conquered. A series of natural disasters had sent the Grunts back technologically and societally, so on top of just generally being in bad shape societally, when the Covenant showed up, the Grunts had no spacefaring capability and no way to withstand the awesome might of the Covenant, who had been roaming the galaxy reverse engineering Forerunner tech for more than 1,000 years by now. The Covenant immediately conquered the Grunts and pressed them into service as the lowest class citizens in the Covenant, good mostly for menial labor and little else. Over time, thanks to their rapid breeding capabilities, the Grunts on High Charity came into conflict with the Jackals, as the Grunts' sheer numbers began infringing on the Jackals' nests, stressing out their pregnant women, causing a spike in prenatal deaths. In response, the Jackals poisoned the Grunts so that thousands of them were rendered sterile. When the Council did nothing, the Grunts, presumed cowardly and stupid, started a revolt so tenacious that the full might of High Charity's military forces were required to handle the uprising. And the Grunts still weren't stopped until the Covenant began orbital bombardment of the Grunts' home planet, at which point the Grunts immediately capitulated. Surprised and impressed by their tenacity, the Grunts were allowed into the military, and their status in the Covenant was elevated slightly, though they still remained firmly at the bottom of the totem pole. Perhaps for this reason, the Grunts have fielded at least 15 more rebellions since then, but as far as we can tell, none of them have led to any events of consequence.
The last race to join the Covenant were the Jiralhanae, or Brutes. The Brutes are a warlike, pack-like species that function in groups but always jockey for superiority. It is perhaps unsurprising then that by the time the Covenant had found them, the Brutes were only just beginning to recover from literally nuking themselves to near extinction. As a fractured society, some packs immediately flocked to the Covenant's cause when encountered, while others engaged the Covenant in serious battle. But considering the gap in technological prowess and the difference in sheer military might, the Brutes were quickly defeated and folded into the Covenant. As the centuries had passed leading up to this point, frictions, old and new, played out within the Covenant's walls. Notably, relations between the Prophets and the Elites was becoming strained, with many of the Prophets worried that the Elites would eventually try to stage a coup and wrest complete control of the Covenant from the Prophets. In the Brutes, the Prophets saw a martial arm that would be easier to control, and so, over time, began slowly putting a plan to replace the Elites with the Brutes into action. Plans that were aided by the disastrous discovery of humanity and humanity's place in the Great Journey.
Almost simultaneously with the discovery of humanity, the Prophets also discovered that humanity had been chosen by the Forerunners as their successors, that evidence had been left behind that stated purely and simply, no interpretation required, that humanity had been chosen to follow the Forerunners' footsteps, not the Covenant, though they still misunderstood what that meant. Since so much of the Covenant's structure was built around the Great Journey, the Prophets knew that if this knowledge became public, it would mean the end of the Covenant itself. So they ordered the absolute annihilation of humanity, sparking a war that would last a little less than 30 years. It would last so long, in fact, that some among the elites began to question why humanity was not being offered a place among the Covenant, unlike every other race the Covenant had encountered and waged glorious war against in the past. These doubts gave the Prophets the seeds they needed to oust the elites from the Covenant, seeds that were greatly nourished by a rapid series of crushing defeats at the hands of humanity, but seeds that would ultimately lead to the downfall of the Covenant itself.
During the war with humanity, after centuries of searching to no avail, not one, but two Halo rings would be discovered and subsequently destroyed by humanity. Not only that, but presumably for the first time, members of the Prophet Triumvirate would fall by enemy hands. The Prophets painted all of this as happening under the Elite's watch and put forth the idea that perhaps the safety of the Covenant would be better in other hands, the Brutes' hands. The elite guards of the Prophets, always elite since the founding of the Covenant, were replaced with Brutes. Generals and ship captains replaced with Brutes. By order of the Prophets, the head elite council members were assassinated by Brutes. Rather than simply ousting the elites, this betrayal sparked a civil war in which the elites were surprisingly quick in effectively counterattacking the Prophets and the Brutes, with the other races spreading about 50-50 behind both sides based upon either dogma or convenience. But the final nail in the Covenant's coffin was that right then, at the worst possible time, a flood outbreak consumed the Covenant capital, High Charity, killing thousands of Covenant while they warred with each other. Shortly thereafter, the remaining members of the Prophet Triumvirate were slain, either at the hands of the Flood, the Elites, or humanity. With their capital destroyed, most of their major leaders dead, and civil war started just as it all came crashing down, the Covenant collapsed.
In the aftermath, chaos reigned. The Prophet's population dropped to only a potential few thousand, and as the elites and Brutes continued warring with one another, the Prophets vanished into the shadows, while simultaneously most of the Covenant's engineers also vanished, leading some to assume the two disappearances are related. The elites were broken by infighting. The Prophets had been their leaders for centuries, and the other races acted as their engineers, medics, and manual labor sources. Now they had to do it all, but they couldn't even agree on what they should do. Factions arose all over the place, some trying to resurrect the Covenant, some going their own way, some even allying with humanity, all while battle with the Brutes continued. The Letglow, or Hunters, mostly split up between the Elites and Brute factions, with slightly more seeming to favor the Elites. A handful of the drones stuck around here and there, but for the most part they happily returned to their home system, largely unconcerned with the affairs of the wider galaxy. The Jackals immediately returned to piracy and mercenary lifestyle, raiding whoever they thought they could take and hiring themselves out to anyone who would pay them. The Grunts mostly stayed with whoever they'd been with when the Civil War started, though a few years later when a powerful AI gave the galaxy an ultimatum, join or die, they joined her, and their planet's infrastructure has seemingly been better for it. The Brutes, like the elites, fight amongst each other for supremacy whilst also battling the elites, some trying to resurrect the Covenant while others have their own plans. Whatever is next for the galaxy, the return of a fully functional Covenant seems very unlikely.
And that's basically the Covenant. Alien mega nation of the Haloverse. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave us a like and share it with someone you know might like it. If you have ideas for videos you'd like to see in the future, do like all of these lovely people, and let us know in the comments down below. If you'd like to see more videos, hit that subscribe button, and if you'd like to see our Let's Plays, follow the link in the description and subscribe to our Let's Play channel.
In the meantime, this has been True Masters and Morons, signing off.